We're looking at the Transcendental Hero, and I cited John Brown as an example of the hero has to be self-reliant in morals, methods, and materials. You got to decide what's right. You got to decide what you're going to do about it, and you got to decide how you're going to do it. And again, even though Thoreau himself wouldn't even have killed an animal, he nevertheless supported John Brown because he felt John Brown had done just that he had an insight into the future of morality. Remember, that's what the Transcendental Hero does. When he has a transcendent experience and he becomes one with the Oversoul, he sees where the Oversoul is going to unfold in the physical world, and when he does that, he can bring some of it back. So he acts in terms of a future that didn't get here yet. And although the country hung John Brown for trying to end slavery through the use of violence, nevertheless, a few short years later, that was exactly what the North did. Put an end to slavery by the use of violence. So he was acting in terms of a morality that just hadn't gotten there yet. Now the problem with that, of course, is that it's very difficult to tell who's a transcendental hero and who's just an ordinary outlaw. In fact, as you can see from number 5, the hero to the timid common herd may seem like just another outlaw, especially when he acts to tear down old traditions, superstitions, and taboos, but his personal irregularities are less important than his individualism. In fact, they're only irregularities when you measure them by somebody else anyway. Remember, everybody's one of a kind. There's never been another you. You're a unique version of the good, and you have the obligation to live out that version of the good. And that means that you're generally going to break tradition, and you're not going to follow custom. In fact, you probably won't even follow a great many of the laws, because the laws weren't made for you. The laws are made by dead people to create a generic society of people who are all the same. And the Transcendentalists, of course, would argue that everybody's different. That's why the Transcendentalists in general, like the European Romantics, saw the state as the enemy, because it always makes rules, and the rules get in the way of your individualism, and you have to follow your heart. And when you follow your heart, again, you're going to be breaking all the rules. And that makes you look like an outlaw. So usually the Transcendental Hero for his own times will look like an outlaw. Did everybody in Concord think that Thoreau was a hero because he lived the way he lived?
No.
No, most of them thought he was a total loser. I mean, here's a guy who's been to Harvard, had a college education, digs ditches, can't hold a steady job. Comes back to surveying, certainly, but for the most part, he didn't do what they would consider, didn't do anything with his college education. They considered him a kind of vagabond. Nobody probably except Emerson admired him. They liked Thoreau because he was kind of an admirable character. But they didn't think he was a hero. They probably thought he was an outlaw. And as you'll see when we look at Margaret Fuller gets seen as an outlaw too, but she's a transcendental hero. The transcendental hero will be breaking these taboos that nobody's dared to break in the past. Emerson couldn't see the difficulty with having a transcendental hero. If you look at number 6, here's another part of the problem. The hero is justified because the uniqueness of individuality requires a unique application of moral principles. In other words, everybody is a unique set of moral principles. They have to apply them to their own life, and so you can't hold anybody really up to the law and measure them because it's not their law. Conscience is the only law. That's why Thoreau tells you. What does Thoreau tell you to do when you come into contact with an unjust law? Follow it until you can get it changed, or break it immediately. Break it immediately. You have to follow your heart. Now, maybe Emerson didn't see the danger of this thinking. Well, what is the danger of saying that everybody's a law unto themselves? The only law you have to follow is your own law.
Then you have the danger of anarchy.
You have the danger of anarchy. If we all follow our own rules, what rules are there? Who will know what the rules are? How will we know how to interact with one another if there aren't any rules for it? Of course, the Romantics felt that as long as we all followed our hearts, it would work out perfectly anyway. how can you tell who the villains are and who are just the individualists? Now, we've had a lot of people who looked like transcendental heroes at first. And it turned out to be anything but. For example, you remember one of the characteristics of the transcendental hero is that they're filled with enormous energy and charisma. They attract people. They're the center of attention everywhere they go. They stir people up because they have so much enthusiasm and energy. So take a guy who has those qualities. They devote a great deal of time to other people with ideas that seem to be crazy. Their ideas seem to be far-fetched. So you have this very charismatic guy that a lot of people are attracted to. He certainly stirs up a place wherever he goes. He's working, he believes, for world peace, for a new way of putting humanity together. He takes a country that's been completely demoralized and bankrupt, believes that he has economic policies and social policies that will put it back on its feet, make it a world leader again, and accomplishes some of those things. Does he sound like a transcendental hero? So far he does. The problem is when he starts to go a little bit further than, in fact, actually not that much further than his original ideals, it turns out that he's a lunatic. Anybody know who that is? Adolf Hitler. Started out to pull Germany out of a depression and restored to being a world power. They felt that they had been unjustly treated at the end of the First World War, which they started. And why is it that when he starts to say, the problem is the people. We need better people. So we're going to breed a master race of tall, blonde, blue-eyed people. None of his followers say, Mein Führer, tall, blonde, blue-eyed people, right? Aren't you a little short, dark-haired, dark-eyed guy? Am I missing something here? How come nobody says that to him? Because this is what Emerson didn't see, was that they would follow a transcendental hero. The transcendental hero isn't supposed to lead you anywhere. All he does is march in the right direction. He points the right general area to go towards. And you know it's the right direction because you can feel it in your heart. But you're not supposed to follow in his footsteps. So that way, in case he does go off, which Emerson didn't think possible. He didn't think you could have anybody who could even look like a transcendental hero and then turn out to be a moral monster. But if the seeming transcendental hero started to do stuff that was obviously crazy, which you could feel in your heart was crazy, you wouldn't follow him anywhere. But I think Emerson vastly underestimated the human desire to be a slave. Very, 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 very few people want to be free. Almost everybody wants their decision. To some extent, we're all institutionalized personalities. You know, those people keep getting put in prison and keep getting put back in the mental institution because they can only function when somebody is telling them what to eat and when to eat and when they can go to sleep and when they can get up. And you think, well, why would anybody want to go back to that? Because you don't have to make any decisions. In a way, it's a kind of absolute freedom. You have no decisions to make. You want to be most of us do what everybody else does. We do what we're expected to do. Because it's the easy thing to do, because it keeps us from having to make decisions. If you want to be an individual, you have to make moral choices almost every minute of the day. That's hard work. It's way more work than most people want to do. So most people don't really want to make decisions. They don't want to be free. They want somebody to come along and tell them where to go and what to do and what to think. And Emerson vastly underestimated that. He thought we all wanted to be transcendental heroes. We all could be transcendental heroes, but not an awful lot of people have that desire. And he didn't recognize that people, once they picked somebody and thought of them as a transcendental hero, would think that their opinions didn't matter anymore. So that, say, here's another guy, a guy who, again, very charismatic, full of energy, seems to be working 24 hours a day for people's good, has some seemingly crazy ideas that do work. If you you don't have very much money. You give me all of your money. We'll put it in one big lump, and that'll make us all rich. What does biology have to do with love and affection anyway? Your biological families aren't the people who really love you. Come and join my group, and we'll all love you for who you are, not because we share a genetic pattern. Anybody know who that is? They end up, 964 of them end up drinking poison Kool-Aid in Guyana. Jim Jones. Jim Jones starts the People's Temple in California. That's the first thing he says. All you people, give me your welfare checks which are next to worthless. If we put them together, money is like atomic fission. So you have to get critical number, and then all of a sudden it starts to draw money in. Your little individual checks won't mean anything. We put them in a big pile. We can start to influence legislation. We can start to buy some congressmen. We can do it the American way. And it works. I mean, when they all commit suicide in Guyana, there's $4 million in gold bullion, and there was nobody in that camp who never made more than $20,000 a year. Because Jim Jones's crackpot ideas on economics seemed to work. As far as abandoning their families were concerned, the great majority of people in the People's Temple felt that they had much more of a family in that cult than they ever had outside of it. So that seemed to be right. So when Jim says, let's take the poison Kool-Aid, they said to themselves, well, I thought he was nuts when he said, give me your money, and he was right. And I thought he was crazy when he said, leave your family, and he was right. So he must be right about the poison Kool-Aid. When they took the Kool-Aid in Guyana, it wasn't the first time they had done it. It was the third. First time Jim says, look, faith is stronger than anything. If you believe you can drink this poison Kool-Aid like I'm going to do, and it won't hurt you. He drinks it, it doesn't hurt him. Everybody else drinks it. Nobody says it's not really poison, it's just a test. Everybody thought, would Jim lie to you? It must be poison. Faith did save him. We drank it. Faith saved us. He's right. Next time he wants to do it, everybody goes, oh, we've seen this drill before. Everybody drinks the Kool-Aid. Now, when they're down in Guyana, it's true. There were 4 guys with automatic weapons who were shooting anybody who didn't drink the poison Kool-Aid and give it to their children. 4 guys with automatic weapons, 900 people. Even if they didn't attack the people with the guns, even if they just ran, half of them at least would have gotten out of there alive. And somebody says give poison to your children and you don't attack the man with the machine gun, there's something seriously wrong with you. Yet they didn't. They didn't because they'd given up their will. They believed this is the Transcendental Hero. He has better insights than we have. We have to do it. He must be right. We must be wrong. This seems crazy to us, but that's that old-fashioned thinking which he's well beyond. And we're not beyond it. So we listen to him. Emerson's idea, see where he got this great man idea. He got that from Carlyle. Transcendental Hero is the great man. There's another philosopher who comes along after him who says, instead of the transcendental hero, he says that once in or twice in a generation, there is a moral adult born among us. And that moral adult acts in terms of a morality which we haven't grown into yet. He doesn't have to follow any of the rules. He doesn't have to follow any of the laws because he understands them better than we do. We need the laws because we're moral children. And we need the laws to keep from hurting ourselves and one another. This is a moral adult. He doesn't need any of the laws. And when he behaves for a set of purposes that none of us can understand. And so he's always justified in his action. Now he called his transcendental hero the Obermensch, or the Overman, or the Superman. Anybody know who he was? Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says that these moral adults can do whatever they want. So, for example, Nietzsche's Superman could shoot a child. 6-year-old. How many of you think you could shoot a 6-year-old? That's good. I'm glad every once in a while I get a person who's got, yeah, I could do that. Do you have one? But what if I told you this? And this is an absolute certainty now. There's no question about this. This 6-year-old that you're going to shoot, if you do shoot him, will grow up to be Adolf Hitler. He'll kill probably 12 to 15 million people before he's done. And this is the only chance you'll ever get to shoot him. If If you don't shoot them, 12 million other people die, a great many of them children. Could any of you shoot them now? If you were absolutely certain that was going to be the case. Still not. Well, Nietzsche would be very unhappy with you. Nietzsche would say a moral adult would have no problem doing that. They might feel bad shooting them, but they would be acting in terms of a higher law that other people couldn't understand. You would say, well, you can't be certain how he's going to grow up. But we're assuming that you can be certain. And Nietzsche would have said the moral adult would know that. He would know how that person's going to turn out. They're going to cost 12 million lives, and so to save 12 million people, you have to do one seemingly horrendous action. If all you saw was the murder of a child, there's nothing worse than that. And yet it would be justified in Nietzsche's terms. Anybody know who Nietzsche's favorite philosopher, who Nietzsche was the favorite philosopher of? Adolf Hitler. That's why he can do those horrible things. I would guess that Jim Jones had also read Nietzsche. The problem with the Nietzschean hero, the problem with the Transcendental Hero is that people give up their will to them, and they do follow them. And a great many of them are attractive people, but they're also lunatics. Charlie Manson would be another one. Now, we can say, well, okay, Emerson didn't have Manson, and he didn't have Adolf Hitler, and he didn't have Jim Jones. So maybe he shouldn't have known about this Transcendental Hero being a danger. But here's a guy from his own time, or not that long before Emerson. A little short guy, enormously charismatic, gets a lot of very big people to do everything he tells them to do, takes a tiny country and turns it into a world power, restores a revolution that had been betrayed by counter-revolutionaries disguised as revolutionaries, created a whole new architecture, revitalized the state that he lived in, and set out to establish world peace. Plunged Europe into chaos, almost brought Western civilization to an end, lost, got exiled, was so charismatic, when he came back, his followers still had their guns. For I think it was about 18 months or so, almost started it all again. Anybody know who it was? Still don't know. Napoleon, little teeny short guy, got all those big people to do whatever he wanted to do on strength of personal vitality. Looked like a transcendental hero, looked like he was leading people in the right direction, and all he caused in the long run was chaos and bloodshed. Emerson should have seen that's what happens when you have a transcendental hero. But he doesn't, because he assumed, first of all, in his version of the Transcendental Hero, why wouldn't a Transcendental Hero ever build an empire? Why wouldn't he gather followers? Would he want followers? No. Remember, for a Transcendental Hero wants to be him, and who does he want you to be? You. He doesn't want you to be him. If you start to follow him, well, in Emerson's essay on Thoreau, he says, there were young men who felt this was the man of men, the man they were in search of. And Thoreau had all these people who wanted to be his follower. And they dressed like him, and they tried to walk like him, and they talked like him. And how did he treat them? He was always antagonistic to them. He was nasty to them most of the time. Why?
He didn't want them following him.
He didn't want them following him. Why didn't he just tell them, don't be me, be you?
We wouldn't have done it.
They wouldn't have. They had to learn that on themselves. That's an insight you have to get. What Thoreau does by being mean to these young men who look up to him, admire him, and want to follow him is the old man with the stick. He keeps being nasty to them, and the more like him they are, the nastier he is, so that sooner or later one of them will go, wait a minute, every time we talk like Thoreau, he gets really mad. And when we walk like him, he really gets mad. He doesn't want us to be like him. Why is that? He wants us to be us. Then it's okay. But Thoreau can't tell you your truth. You have to come to that. Again, Emerson thought that a transcendental hero wouldn't gather followers because he wouldn't follow, he would discourage followers. And again, that he would only go in a certain direction. Now, the transcendental does have a use in pointing out the direction when people are lost. because the oversoul is unfolding in a particular direction. He does have insights into the future of morality. And in living in terms of it, he is, in a way, pointing the direction of what the world is morally going to be like in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. So he tells you in the general direction to go, but he doesn't tell you how to get there. And any time he starts to go off too far on his own, you can feel in your heart that the stuff he's doing is wrong for you. And that's all it has to be. It doesn't even have to be bad for humanity. It just has to be bad for you, and you would stop following. So to Emerson, the transcendental hero was no problem. He wasn't a threat to anybody. And yet, a lot of people who looked like they were transcendental heroes turned out to be a big problem for society. Now the thing about being the transcendental hero is that you do live in terms of a future morality. Now again, Emerson calls him the poet. And when he says in number 7, poetry, which includes poetic prose, has a prophetic nature, he doesn't mean that the transcendental hero can predict specific events in the future. What he can predict is where morality is going. And although he called him the poet doesn't have to write any poetry. He doesn't, in fact, have to write anything. His life could be his art. And simply by living, he could express the transcendent one and the right direction, although not the right way, better than anybody might do it in words. The difficulty, of course, again, is that it's hard to tell them from an outlaw. If we got into a time machine and went back to 1845 or 1840, we would look like moral outlaws. Almost all of our beliefs, almost all the women in here would be put in jail right away for what you're wearing. Why?
Because only the men wore pants.
Only men wore pants. Wearing men's clothes, next you want to do men's jobs. Then you won't have babies anymore. Families will fall apart. Civilization will be destroyed, all because of fashion. So you have these fashion ideas which are outlaw and dangerous to the state. The fact we believe in racial equality would be seen as a dangerous idea and would have made us look like an outlaw to our followers. The fact that we think that the genders are equal and can do the same job, those would have been seen as dangerous ideas. The modern idea that if you are attracted to somebody, you're entitled to sleep with them would have been seen as a terribly dangerous idea. They would have said, who is going to get married if they can get sex without it? Nobody. No marriages, no children society comes to an end. Free love is a terribly dangerous idea. All of those things would make us look like outlaws, but we wouldn't be. We would be transcendental heroes because we would be living in terms of a morality that hasn't got here yet. By 2001, all of those ideas would be generally acceptable, and they wouldn't seem like outlaw ideas, but in 1840 they do. So if you're living in 1840 and you're living in terms of a future morality, you're going to look like an outlaw. And it's hard to separate the two. Emerson assumed that it wasn't. Why not? One, the outlaw probably wouldn't have a philosophy behind what he does. And secondly, a lot of things that the outlaw does you could feel are wrong. And so you wouldn't do them. You wouldn't follow them. Now there are, almost everybody we look at from here on out can qualify as a transcendental hero. And maybe one of the best examples is somebody that we didn't read, Margaret Fuller. I had mentioned Margaret Fuller before. She was the editor of The Dial, the Transcendentalist magazine. And she definitely looks like an outlaw to everybody around her. First of all, she thinks that women are the intellectual equals of men. Now, up until 1820, a woman couldn't even go inside a college classroom. From, I think, 1820 until about 1840, women could attend classes, but they couldn't take the exams and they couldn't get a degree. Margaret Fuller is one of the first women to get a degree. At the time, when it came to scholarship, the Germans were considered the greatest scholars. Margaret Fuller not only gets a degree, but Margaret Fuller becomes majors in German. There's a hierarchy within academia in terms of what you are, even like in English there is. For example, a Shakespearean scholar is way above an American literature scholar. And early American lit has more status than 20th century American lit. World lit probably has more status than American lit has. British lit has more status than that. And again, Shakespeare's up at the top. And down at the bottom you would have creative writing, then regular writing, and then journalism. In her day, the top of the top, if you were German, you would be a Goethe scholar. Goethe is the German Shakespeare. She becomes a Goethe scholar. She's so good that even the Germans recognize her as a brilliant mind. So she breaks all kinds of new bounds there. Women were not allowed to give public speeches. So Margaret Fuller doesn't give public speeches. Margaret Fuller has conversations. And you could pay, just like Emerson could go out and give a lecture on the Chautauqua circuit and charge people. Margaret Fuller couldn't, so Margaret Fuller had conversations, and mostly women came to it, but a lot of them brought their husbands, and they paid to get in. But she talked, and then they asked a question, so it wasn't actually a lecture, she said, and so she broke another big taboo doing that. She selects the manuscripts and things for the Dial. She runs the most important literary and intellectual magazine in the country. A woman does that. That breaks all kinds of new ground. Emerson liked Margaret Fuller and was kind of proud of her until Margaret turned, I think she's like around 30 or 32, and she discovers her sexuality. Now, what was a woman's sexuality supposed to be like in the 1840s? Same as it is now?
You really weren't supposed to have it.
You really weren't supposed to have any real interest in sex. It's for having babies, and basically you did it to get hugged. That was about it. You're not supposed to have any interest on your own. You certainly weren't supposed to be inventive. And you definitely weren't supposed to see this as a form of recreation. And Margaret Fuller discovers that women have an enormous sexuality and that it's really a lot of fun. Now her boyfriend thinks he's died and gone to heaven because he's got a woman who really likes sex. Now if you really liked sex, you kind of kept it to yourself. What would your husband think if you really enjoyed what was going on?
I think there was something wrong with it.
Yeah, what is the matter with this woman? What was your past really like? Where did you learn? I don't believe you invented this. I don't think you made that up. Where did you learn that? They would have been horrified. But he thinks this is great. But not only is Margaret interested in sex, but Margaret is a very creative and original person and begins to take the aggressive role instead of being passive. That's way too much for him. Now that's over the line. He can't handle it. I think part of the reason for the 19th century, probably like the centuries before it, had a kind of intuition that women's capacity for pleasure is basically infinite, and men's isn't. It's a recycling time for men. So basically, men can't keep up with women. Deep down, 19th century men really knew that. So if a woman ever discovered her sexuality and began to make sexual demands, there just wasn't anybody that was going to be able to live up to that. And so it was kind of scary. And her boyfriend is so scared by the idea that he runs away to Europe. Margaret follows him. Emerson is beside himself. She's 32 years old. I mean, remember, in those days, if you had property or money, and you got married, it went to your husband, and he controlled it. If your parents died and you were single, a man at the bank controlled your money. He gave you a certain amount a month, and if you needed any more, you had to go down and convince him that there was good reason that you might need that extra money. And when you were 32, it was turned over to you, because then you were past that age where you might be swept off your feet by some guy and make a lot of foolish emotional decisions. So Margaret's at the age of adulthood for women, and she's chasing her boyfriend to Europe. Now, when she gets to Europe, he's pretty frank. He says, I just can't handle that kind of role reversal. And Margaret says, well, that's okay. So she has 2 lovers. And now, at the time, he didn't have any lovers. Margaret's got 2. Eventually, she has a guy who's her lover who's a minor Italian count named Isolde. Isolde wants to marry her. What would most women do with a proposal of marriage from even a minor Italian count?
They'd jump on it.
They would jump for it. And Margaret won't marry him. Margaret says, I don't believe in marriage. In fact, when you read her book, Woman in the 19th Century, she says, until women are allowed to become what they are, men will never be able to become what they are. That the roles that women were locked into also locked men into certain roles, which they didn't necessarily find comfortable or appropriate. And there were whole sides of men that weren't developed because we had these rigid gender stereotypes. And for a woman, marriage was a trap. She didn't legally get to make any of her decisions when she married. When the property wasn't hers, Margaret said the only way you can be yourself is never to get married. So she philosophically didn't believe in marriage. She wouldn't marry him. She gets pregnant. If you got pregnant, Quasimodo shows up, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and offers to marry you, you're overjoyed. Because this will at least avoid some of the scandal. And Isolde wants to marry her. And Margaret still won't marry him. So what do people think of those attitudes? Do they see them as transcendental, or do they see them as outlaw? Outlaw. If women stop marrying people at all, then the family's going to fall apart and there's going to be chaos as far as they're concerned. War breaks out in Italy, a civil war, and Margaret Fuller becomes the first woman war correspondent. Now, if there is a manly set of writers, it's got to be the war correspondents. They're getting shot at all the time. She leaves the baby in the north and goes into the south of Italy to report on the war. When she does, she gets cut off. The baby's put out with a wet nurse, and she's not being paid. No, she's a poor woman. She needs the money. She stops feeding the baby. If Margaret hadn't gotten back when she did, the baby would have starved. She managed to get back through the lines. What would the 19th century have thought of that? Abandoning your baby to go and do a man's job. They would have thought it was horrible. And yet now, getting a nanny or whatever and pursuing a career, nobody would think twice about it, think that it was immoral. Because we live in terms of a 20th century morality, and so was Margaret Fuller. Her problem was that she was 150 years ahead of her time. Once the world caught up with her, there wouldn't have been any question about whether what she did was right or not. Finally, at the end, she does actually get to be prophetic in the sense of the Psychic Friends Network. She's coming back to America. Now, her sister said that she married Isolde after all. But if she did, it's not recorded anywhere. And I doubt that she did. When she's about to get back on the boat, she has real misgivings about getting on this boat. She gets on the boat, something really bad is going to happen. But she says to herself, well, Emerson's mad at me. All my transcendentalist friends are mad at me. I got to go home with this guy I'm not married to and a baby and introduce him to my parents. That's going to be really tough. That's what I'm afraid of. That's what's bothering me. She gets on the boat. And the boat goes down in a storm off Sandy Hook. And she and her husband and the baby all drown. Now when the boat starts to sink, who do they get off first? Women and children. Margaret won't go. She keeps the baby. In other words, she acts what the 19th century would have said like a man all the way to the very end. She lashes herself to the mast with Isolde and the baby, and apparently that was how they drowned. So she actually did have a premonition of her own death, but she acts in terms of a future morality. They looked at her action as headstrong and stubborn and futile. She should have gotten off the boat with the baby. Modern people would look at it and say she She had as much right to be a hero as anybody else did. And she made a rational choice, and a choice she had the right to make, whether you agree with it or not. So she looks like a transcendental hero. Why doesn't Emerson use her as the poster child for transcendentalism? Margaret Fuller, this is what a transcendentalist should be.
Because she was a woman.
Because she's a woman, and she's a scary woman. She's breaking all the rules, which is what a transcendental hero does, but Emerson wants a movement that people can relate to, not one that scares them. It's almost a Ben Franklin-like decision. As a transcendentalist, he should have picked the transcendentalist who was most themselves, and that's really Margaret Fuller. And instead, he picks Henry David Thoreau. Anybody have any questions on the Transcendental Hero? Okay, let me change this tape and we'll look at Emerson.